computer. Hi, Joe. This
How
is
you
Jim again.
doing?
This is our
Hi, Jim.
fourth.
How are you?
Good. This is our fourth conversation. And I believe this conversation is going to be about you taking us for a journey into your more adult professional life and talking about the becoming and making of you entering into and joining the world and the making of yourself. So that's what I understand we're going to be talking about. And I want to say before we begin recording, and I pass it on to you, that I've really enjoyed these conversations. And I think that I've learned a lot about you and I love your stories. So the more stories that you can tell, the more I'll certainly enjoy it. So I'm going to pass it on to you and you can just start the conversation.
Well, it's hard to impress a guy whose grandmother had him writing numbers on his tricycle in a secret way, but those are great stories. Okay, well, I gave this thing the rather elaborate title, Finding, Becoming, Making, and Discovering Myself, comma, 7 times 7.
So tell us
And
about that.
yeah, well, and the biblical number 7 functions as the Western number 10. So when you start saying forgive someone 7 times by 7 or that, you're beginning to troll for infinity.
Mhm.
So I chose 7 and went out of my way to choose a magic number just because I wanted the resonance that this, like the first volume, is self is one and self is, here we are. Self is one and self is many. And just one aspect of self, a very important one, how am I? All right, Rosie?
You're good.
Is body. But God knows how important mind is. And then, of course, what is mind? So the book we're dealing with is far more humble in a way. It's dealing with those questions by just saying, well, I'll tell my early life and see how many selves are there and what kind of selves and what the selves are made out of. So
Sounds
that's the
good.
title.
Yeah, I love it.
Okay. As pointed out in the last talk, Kathy transformed me, an only child who tended to have an introverted side. She made me a husband and a father, and therefore a greater part of the world around me. So, to use some quotes that our friend Rosie here dug up for me, and I selected some. Kathy gave me a home and love. That's mine. Or to use a few of quotations selected by my granddaughter Rosie, where we love is home, home that our feet may leave, but not our hearts. That's from Oliver Wendell Holmes, Sr. And one from Wendell Berry, more contemporary. If you don't know where you are, you don't know who you are. I like that.
Yeah, I like that too.
And then there's a Rebecca Solnit, she's from California. She simultaneously produced a book on walking at the same time I did. But her book is more about strolling and walking as observing. In other words, walking up a social class from the majority of humanity that trudged on unpaved roads in a world without sidewalks. And they had to go where they were going, even if it meant crossing a marsh or actually walking with their knuckles in the ground. I mean, walking is not a delicate artistic activity in my book on foot. It's something that grows out of bipedalism. It goes right back to our evolution. But
Just
anyhow,
just
Rebecca Sloan,
as a sidelight, Joe, just as a little comment on that, when I was looking at and studying developmental education, there's a lot of people in developmental education that say that once a child learns how to walk, they've learned the most complicated thing that they'll ever learn in their entire lives. And so the rest of the job as a parent is basically not to necessarily teach children new things, but to draw out from them since they've already overcome the most difficult thing that they'll ever have to learn. So,
oh, that's nice. I once read in a child development book that a child just has to see somebody come from one side of the stage and then disappear on the other side. And right away their minds are alerted to when's that person coming again and from which side. But Solnick had some very nice quotes, and Rosie had two of them. She wrote, "Sense of place is the sixth sense, an internal compass and map made," and this is what I like, "made by memory and spatial perception together." So we see, we learn. And of course, with walking, the hands then got free, the fingertips became sensitive. And so we could see far out in the distance, but we also could grab a little bug and examine it. And we had a maneuverability among things in a general sense and in a specific sense that no animal has that I know of. Okay, so sense is the sixth sense. And here's a last quote from her. I actually took two quotes. "When you give yourself to places, they give yourself back." I think that's a very nice idea. You invest yourself in a place, but by God, the place sort of takes you over. The more one comes to know them, the more one seeds them with the invisible crop of memory and associations that will be waiting for you when you come back. So each of your glances is like a seed in the world. And then the seed isn't just in the world, significant glances into your memory, and they crop back up by association. So even when the place is not present, it wakes up in you. I find that I like that kind of reciprocal exchange between self and world.
mm-hmm.
So she went on, "More one seeds them with the invisible crop of memories and associations that will be waiting for you when you come back, while new places offer up new thoughts, new possibilities." So let's talk about some new places. We're on to number 2. That was quotes for sort of 1. I'd like to say people are places and places are people. If I were doing something more complicated, I would try to say places are peoples and times and people are places. So it's fairly complex. Anyhow, I immediately became friends with Kathy's McAdoo friends and their new husbands and a handful of her Rochester nursing companions. At the same time, throughout our marriage, Kathy took me to new places and neighborhoods. Wherever she was, she did good works, joined mothers' health projects, took up singing, music, and entered reading groups. So even though she's a quiet person, she was a joiner, and a chorus could rarely emerge that she wasn't singing it. Okay, so we're in a small, no sooner were we in Cottonwood, that small village of 800 where we first settled in southwest Minnesota, then I sought the lay of the land. That's my nature too, even though I might be introverted and individual. like most people, I want to know what's going on, who's got the power, who represents a threat, who could be a friend, and kind of could I get any warmth out of the place? So we got to know Norwegians and Protestants, and being a Catholic was one of the first questions I was asked in Cottonwood. What's your name and what church are you going to? And if you're going to the Catholic Church, that meant you were probably going to associate with the Belgian or German farmers. You were a Bauer, a Boer, all those words for non-urban. You were there was that play already because they were the newer immigrants, the Catholics. And I sought to find out who the powers in town were. I disastrously ran for the school board almost my first or second year in town. The only debate I remember is one woman called me up and said, "Do you think girls should have to wear uniforms to school?" And she was kind of a known conservative. And my reply is, I think everyone should have to wear uniforms to school. Anyhow, when the election was over, I got 2 votes out of probably 600. I was so soundly defeated that I think I created a lasting sympathy for me. No one had ever been beaten into the dust like that. So, but then I turned around and I started, just for the good of the town and my own curiosity, on the lake project. I thought Cottonwoods Lake and having a nice lake, a clean lake, a lake people go to for recreation or want their house on, the future of the town hinged on that lake. And I think I was right. And a lot of the big shots in town, the biggest big shot, who was head of North Star Insurance, he entirely agreed with me. He was a lake lover. He had a big house on the lake. He originally sailed his high sailboat with a tall mast, and he gave me maps and all sorts of things. And he entered me into being even giving a presentation to the Almighty Lions Club, which proportionally was the largest Lions Club in Minnesota in proportion to the city population. They had 100 members in a town of 800 people.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
It's incredible. And guess what? Yours truly, even though I didn't know anything about it, put his foot in ecology, waters and rivers, drainage, purification, what the function of drainage ditches were. And all of a sudden, I was on a landscape, and I observed this. When I was in Southern California, what did you want to do with water? You wanted to steal it and hoard it, even if it meant you'd take and swallow the whole Colorado River and hold it in your tummy. You wanted water. And if you were in Southwest Minnesota, what did you want to do with water most of the time? Send it downstream. And if you were rich enough, you started to drain all the wetlands on your land. And I love the contrast of, I'm going to keep water. No, I'm going to get rid of it. One guy was called, I believe, from Clarkfield, a nearby town. He was called Jimmy the Ditch Digging Son of a. And what rhymes with ditch, I'll leave it to my children who will listen to this figure out what rhymes with ditch. He ate too much cod and was buried under 6 feet of sod. I put my foot in ecology, waters, and river. And meantime, Kathy and I made friends up and down Main Street. My oldest daughter, Felice, spent her evenings next door with Beth Ludwig watching Oh, what's that program the kids like so much? Yeah, I know this.
Sesame Street.
Sesame Street. And she got on great with the neighbor, and it gave the neighbor someone of her own. She was widowed, and and she claimed her husband was the founder of the first gasoline co-op in all of Minnesota. So
Wow.
all of a sudden I began to learn the history of these co-ops. Can be a matter of local pride too. And it can be falsification. And then you get things like in Wood Lake, they melded down, I think they melded down their school bells for scrap metal during World War II. What I'm driving at is what we might take as an object, an old antique. Every object that amounted to anything could have a history in these small towns. And some towns didn't drain their water sufficiently, and they paid for it. It's in other words, even though the story might look repetitious, there's awful variations in the countryside. Because who should pay the taxes for those ditches is a good one. That's why tax debates or ditch debates become costs. So you got the drift, I think, of what I'm saying. Kathy, who even nursed the man across the street, no cost, no charge or anything, and he was a World War I soldier who'd been gassed in World War I. And I had a friend whose father had been gassed in World War I. So in a place, little pieces in your memory and so on fit together. So Cottonwood took hold of me, and Kathy was promoting elective home birth. She formed a chapter of La Leche League, which with the powers of breastfeeding. She hauled my daughter Felice and my son Tony, my two oldest children, and me. We got hauled off to Toronto. We played and visited the Italian neighborhood while she was in this big convention hall of breastfeeders from all over the universe. So, well, at least all over the earth. I don't know about the universe. So we got involved in things. And just to give one more example of how Kathy, I was there, I was part of it, but they used our living room to form the first food co-op in Marshall, when food co-ops like the Wedge were getting popular in the late 60s, 70s. And by God, they formed one right in my living room that evening. And I came out saying as a joke, I wanted to be a professor. I'd be damned if I'm going to end up a grocer. So I didn't have much to do with it. But Kathy was there faithfully working. Occasionally, she'd get me to lift the Swanee White flour bags that were coming to the co-op. They need a few strong guys. But the co-op was just filled with wonderful fights. Like if one guy were an anti-feminist, but he grew organic carrots, can you afford to sell his organic food even though, yeah, you get what I'm saying? I mean, there's a spark around everything's a spark around those people. So Cottonwood formed life for us, and we got to know some farmers, went out and visited them.
And you might want to just, as I'm listening to this, it really shows me that Kathy was really many selves in this whole relationship with you. I mean, she was a person of many selves, given all the things that she was doing them quietly, but at the same time, being a different self in each one of these activities that she participated in, no?
Right. And I think one of the stunning things as you get older is you discover women can mutate themselves and have to mutate themselves if they're going to head a home up or have a family or have a husband. They have to mutate themselves across all kinds of lines. And so meantime, I got to go off and not just take a job at a 4-year college. I got to create a 4-year college, literally from the ground up. We were the first large class of faculty brought there. The college was 2 years old. I mean, we knew the kids who carried furniture to their classroom, brand new furniture for their first sit. We knew which buildings were newer. We knew the battles that went over getting a building. We saw how the head of the science could be a ruthless dictator and try to gobble up all the space. I mean, you had all these feelings. And in the course of that, you built a few enemies and you built a lot of friends and a lot of experience and a lot of memories because you made a college. When I used to go up to the University of Michigan, Minnesota, which I did regularly because I had a lot of friends in the history department and some in other departments. I mean, they were wonderful. They were highly intelligent, but as far as understanding how the university works, they were down on the level of a D. They were terribly naive. I mean, because we not only understood the politics, we made the politics. In curriculum, we were, and I mean just a handful of us, were the crucial players in defining the general studies for all students. We created the social science curriculum, and we let the sociologists and anthropologists have their say, of course, with their program. But we created the history program from top to bottom. And I'm bragging, but I think it was truthful. I created the senior year sequence of historiography classes, which was my specialty in undergraduate school, and I learned a fair amount about it in graduate school. And in the class I set up, the three-quarter class, if you wish, the first one they studied the philosophy of history and the history of history. Those were subjects that went back to my Ann Arbor days. The second one, which was sort of new to me, was select and research a topic in local and rural history. In that way, the school or that part of the curriculum was in advance of me. Students were invited to write histories on little, tiny, tiny villages along the river. One woman imaginatively wrote what was Native American education like in the area. Another, it may have been the same woman, but she wrote, how did they dress for funerals when they first came to our area? I got a little interested in medicine, and some started to be interested in ecology, not ecology, in the study of first diseases in our area. What were the first diseases? What were the consequences of them? And I can't tell you. And then I got to examine everyone. We had one man in Cottonwood who wrote a 3-wheeler. When his wife died, he took down all the curtains and put his metal lathe in the front room. And he thought that putting chlorine in water was a communist plot. And when I had a slight disagreement with him, he called me a communist. So we had that was, I won't tell you his name, but translated into English out of German, it was steel maker. Okay, but each colleague had a kind of area they were interested in. Chairman Maynard brought an interest in religion, to a degree, farm protest, and how the people found, how they got married, how they interacted. He was very interested in that. He was from the area. Rather heroically came back to teach because he believed, I never did quite understand this, but I do understand it. He believed he owed the area something. So
he wanted to give back, right?
yes, giving back. So he wanted to give back from this education he had that was quite fine, and he could have had a job in New England. So, and then Dave Nass, who was having trouble getting on with old decrepit faculty at Mankato, he was very interested in farm protest. Marshall was shut down by striking farmers. We had great sheriff disputations. So each one brought something. And this fellow Nass, who was new from Mankato the second year I was there, he was interested in electricity. And when farmers got electricity, which was very late in western Minnesota, at the end of World War II or after, then the question became, what did they first use electricity from? And if you say anything other than the windmill to generate energy so you could milk your cattle or milk your cows, you don't know what you're talking about. But then it eventually got to radios and indoor stuff. But electronic goods were first on the farm and then in the farmer's house. Okay, so there was all that. And then quite a small miracle. An old friend of mine, Ted Radulowski, who I knew at Wayne State, I've mentioned him before, I won't elaborate. And I knew him later when he was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, just fresh out of the military service. He joined us the second year as a specialist in Russian history. And he was a fiend at getting grants and bringing speakers. That was almost like the trophy. If you go pheasant hunting, you want to bring back a bird.
Mm-hmm.
If Ted went thinking he wanted to, what do they call it? A game pouch you carry around your stomach. He wanted to stick a grant in his pouch or bring someone the future connection to my establishment. He was somewhat rather brilliant institutional climber. He, in fact, later left our school a couple times to go to Washington. But Ted was terribly defensive of the Poles. This was the era of the Polish joke.
Mm-hmm.
And if Ted heard a Polish joke he didn't like, he'd call up the radio station. And of course, he'd say, "This is Thaddeus Radulowski, doctor." And I'd insist I receive time on radio to correct da-da-da statement, and he'd get it. But he also did more generous and humane things, but those were very defensive and creative things. He created the Polska Kielbasa Days for nearby Ivanhoe, and then a town with the great Polish name, Wilno. And those were both located 30 miles to the north of Marshall. So it put us in contact yet with, well, Lincoln County, which is poorer soils on higher land and closer to the Dakotas. And that, I say that sounds like, what the hell are you talking about all this stuff for? But when you lived in Southwest Minnesota, if you live with any geographic sensitivity, you had one foot on the plain and another one was running up and running out west to the prairie and beyond the prairie into the Dakotas.
So, Joe, during this time that we're talking about, were you just a faculty member there,
Yeah.
or were you doing something else that you were able to?
I was a faculty member, but if I'd take a trip over to Sioux Falls, I might, I'm giving you an example, but if I took a trip over there in my car, I might be stopped all of a sudden because a guy was herding sheep. And I was just getting used to all this corn and soybean and learning about the history of those crops. And all of a sudden, I was in a territory where there aren't going to be crops. There's going to be more scattered grazing.
Mhm.
And the smallest trips or even encounters or conversations open new doors to new thought. Even the city of Sioux Falls, in my years in Marshall, I watched it grow up. I went to different spots at Sioux Falls. And so I was watching one part of the prairie grow and sadly, another part of the prairie dying
Mm.
as the farmers weren't having as many children, as their farms were getting bigger, and their kids were going away, the ones often to advanced colleges. I ended up talking and ending up in demographics. I didn't know anything about demographics, and here I'm addressing the League of Cities on what will the 1990 census look like.
Hmm.
And out of that, I produced a book called The Decline of Rural Minnesota, where I had no training in this, but you can learn things. Took all the census records for our region, basically the 19 counties and the towns, and traced them from 1950 and then projected them on 1990.
Hmm.
I even developed rules of what would be the outcome. And I was broadly corrected. And I was the hero of a few courageous people in our area, but I also was the villain of local boosters. But I think I mentioned that in the last talk.
Mhm. A little
So,
bit.
okay, but now at the college, and I'm at point 4, if you wonder on the 7 where I am, we very soon had to shift from making a college to saving a college or save our jobs. There was all sorts of talk about closing Southwest State. That was very dramatic talk, and it was serious. We're getting visits by legislators that had merger with Mankato, possibly turn us into a junior college. And we were up to our necks. So, in a nutshell, without getting into all the politics we got into, and I was right at the center. I was the founder of the first teachers union, MFT Local 2399. We even had a song, and it was quite a good song. Dale Sparling, a geologist, wrote it for us. But we had initial battles. Our initial battles were, who were we, faculty? Because we had a lot of people who wanted to claim they were faculty for the prestige and rights of that. But the problem is then they might outvote the faculty. And then all of a sudden you don't have a group anymore. So there was the original problem of defining ourselves. And that went to, we want to bargain for things. And we don't want to just talk to ourselves and then send up a recommendation to an administrator. We want to meet them at a bargaining table. And we want to have shudder, terror, cower in the corner. We wanted a union. I was at one meeting where it was called the Interfaculty Organization. We called it, rather than the IFO, Interfaculty Organization, I called it the UFO, the unidentified flying object. Every time it saw a boss anywhere near or an administrator, it took off and hid. So one woman at a meeting, a big meeting we were having, that I had the fiendish and clever idea. Instead of spreading out our people in all different meetings, we just went to the 1 or 2 meetings where power was at stake.
Mm.
And we did very well that way, even though we were a very small college. 13 of us might be voting, where the expectation is there'd only be one of us.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were able to bully our way through the organization a little bit. But at the main assembly, one woman said, I think I said this last time, but I enjoyed it a lot. I wish we could find a softer word than collective bargaining and strikes. Collective bargaining was the word. And I raised my hand and I said, I think the good lady is looking for collective supplication. That's about her definition. So we had a lot of fun, a lot of smart talking. And each meeting became a history. We'd get together and drink beer and tell about these episodes. Sometimes they were just verbal. Sometimes a lot was at stake when we were out talking with legislators, which Democratic legislators we could influence, I mean, we got quite a little list of who's who in Minnesota government.
So as faculty members, particularly as an historian, did you have a sense as you were doing this of the importance of the history of what you were doing, because you were breaking some new ground and you were doing something different? So I just wondered if you sort of reflected on that while you were doing it. That's what I'm asking.
No, I did, because we knew by joining the MFT, the Minnesota Federation of Teachers, not the MEA, which at the time was we had swear words for that, but was basically a company union. We were on breaking ground in the nation. We were aware that we were breaking ground in the nation. And then my father, who was deep in Detroit labor, I already had a kind of introduction to strikes, the different types of unions. Mm-hmm. And so somehow or other, I could feel, I'm not sure I did exactly, but we were bringing Detroit to Southwest Minnesota.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In the form of an Italian American of mixed breed. Okay, so these life and death struggles, they were very dramatic. Sometimes they involved legislators, etc. And there's histories we wrote of them. I wrote a history of the college, which if somebody's looking for a short survey, I wrote the 25th anniversary history of the college. They'll find a treatment of what was going on more in detail than I'm obviously giving. But it electrified our energies, intelligence, friendships, and lives. And frankly, it was wearing. It was tearing. You know, we're bringing up 4 children. We're trying to get a new curriculum together. We're trying to save our jobs. And we're trying to influence, which we were successful, the Bureau of Labor Mediation in the state. Mm-hmm. And we realize we're joining the collective world of power to resist the emerging collective world of power that was developing around putting all the colleges into one state college university system, mm-hmm. which they eventually did. Right. So we had that experience. So home, town, wife, and a college, ranging from the curriculum to the unions, all filled up my head, filled up my energy, and I was young. It was like I didn't march off to war, but I marched off to a kind of war. It was my 1941, 1945, played out in western Minnesota.
Mhm.
Number 5, that wasn't all that was moving me. I was moved by matters of family, and I was moved by scholarly issues. So even though this is going on, I had to think about family and legacy and local and scholarly issues. And occasionally, of course, like anybody, there's a question, who am I in all this? But one thing probably stood out. My father, who went to work when he was 16, had the ability to go to college, had to support his mother and 4 sisters, taking over from a terrible stepfather that was put in prison. But after working faithfully for 43 years at Western Union, they forced his retirement at age 59, even though he'd worked 43 years and only missed 2 days of work in 43 years.
Wow.
But they forced retired him because Western Union, which couldn't compete with telephones, was top heavy in employees. They had to really cut back. And my dad was part of the cutback. And I had to give a talk. Did I tell you this before?
No.
Okay. I had to give a talk at my father's farewell. And the condition of my talk is the company not come and give him a gold watch. And they didn't. And I won't talk about the meeting itself, but I managed to satisfy my mother, which was to please the relatives and kick the company's rear end up and down, not head on like you're begging, but with cuts and strokes,
Mm-hmm.
And I think I gave a talk that worked because I settled on the theme, our family, our kind of people, us workers, we're all migrants, we're all immigrants and migrants. And our history, and the subtitle would be Immigrants and Migrants, our history is greater than any company. The heart of our we are of heart and loyalty. We go beyond circumstances. In other words, my talk was, my father was a flag bearer for keeping the family going. He wasn't just a worker at Western Union. So I used the substitute. The talk seemed to work. So I had that theme too. Who's enduring present circumstances, but has, as a matter of heart and loyalty, greater matters? So I had that theme going on. At the same time, I'd been to Sicily and got to know the Nobel nominee, Danilo Dolci, the nonviolent reformer in Western Sicily. And he did interviews with peasants and interviews with shepherds and interviews with people here and in the ghettos. And it was all part, and he dealt with contemporary health problems in Sicily, drainage problems, by the way. And there was an earthquake in Sicily. He tried to deal with the living people and history of Sicily. And I spent about 3 weeks there. Dolce came to the college. I got him to stop off. He hitchhiked, by the way, from Glencoe. And then I don't know where we drove him. Wasn't so far. And I don't know if he put his thumb back out or he got something. But he made Sicily alive for me in a matter of research and study. And that opened the door. Maybe every single place was a place of research and study in which you grow yourself, but you add to the place by giving its story out. In other words, how are they migrants and immigrants in time? So right across from Sicily was France, particularly rural France, and I must say non-Parisian France, non-northern France. And so with a degree in French Canada, which is filled with peasants and folklore, and by the way, I have Acadian background on my mother's side. And then I had written my dissertation on 20th century French thought. I was set up to go to the first sabbatical, for my first sabbatical at SMSU. I was set up to go for a year-long NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities Scholarship, with Eugen Weber, who became a friend. And he's author of many books, Eugen Weber. But he wrote a wonderful book. He let me see a manuscript in 1976 called Peasants in the Frenchmen. In other words, how did France make those peasants into Frenchmen? Change their language, change their lives, change their schooling, make them part of the whole nation, despite its great diversity. So in a way, he too was giving local places glory. Well, when I later asked him a couple years after being with Weber in 76, 77, I couldn't resist asking him, as I was getting more into the local studies of Southwest Minnesota, how is this place changing? Who's changing it? Why is it being changed? How is it being, to use a word that was fairly popular in scholarship at the time, how is it being modernized? What does it mean for family size? On and on, all the questions. And I asked him who was the greatest French scholar, local scholar of locality in France. And he put me in contact with an amazing man, a French scholar, jurist, and advocate of local places and lives. His name, and I wrote a long, long article on him. His name was Guy Thuillier, Thuillier. He wrote over 30 books. He was continuously doing research on all sorts of things. Everything became possible history. Can I read this quote here?
Sure.
And
I want to be conscious of our time too, because we're 7:45, and so I want to make sure that you cover the things that you want to cover.
Oh yeah,
in the next 15 minutes. But go ahead.
No, thanks, Jim. Although Thuillier is no separatist, he finds in the provinces the richness of France a key to understanding the modern world and its dramatic transformation. So France became his thing. And just for one deflection, and then I'll be very close to the end of the talk. When I was leaving a coffee shop, a restaurant called The Mill, the Moulin in Paris, Thuillier broke out with that sentence, "Il faut être une histoire de la poussière." There must be a history of dust. And I knew the word poussière. but I had to suffer. I said, et qu'est-ce que c'est la poussière, de petites choses comme ça? And il a dit, certainement. And he thought of it as a way to write a history of smallness.
Mhm.
I turned it into, I went home, damn it, with just that one thought on my mind. So I said, I'm going to write a history of dust. But he was writing it like a history of how we cleaned, what brushes we used, the rags, who used them. And I turned it into, how did we go to the small and ever smaller, to the invisible?
Mhm.
And what was the trip which got me back into my standard Western European history? But the interplay between the local, my universal history, France, and Sicily also meant every machine, every activity in Southwest Minnesota could be a subject for my students to write on, or occasionally me to write on. I wrote a history of sound in the countryside, a little essay form. And on it goes. When we developed the rural studies program, we were doing histories of manure. We were doing histories of this. We were doing histories. I was quite angry we couldn't find somebody to do a history of microbes. How have the soils changed microscopically in the last 100 years as we have transformed the subsoil? What is our history of insects like? And I couldn't find any micro historians, and I tried at the University of Minnesota, but it was too micro for them. So with those insights, I carried the insights. This is the sixth, but really last point, although I'll make a pretend seventh point. Dulce, Weber, Twillier, and my own and my family's migrations provided more than I knew, a way to think about the people of Southwest Minnesota, their institution, their machines. So I was dealing with the transferability and the applicability of themes of place, of family, place, migration, settlement, mind, and culture.
I might want to add that you also were doing giving a tremendous amount of respect to every one of those things that you just talked about in terms of the people and even down to the dust that came from southwestern Minnesota. You were respectful, and I think that's one of the reasons I think you were so readily accepted and your works were so popular in some ways, because there was a lot of respect there.
Well, thanks. It kind of came home a few weeks ago when they named a local research room in my name. It's quite.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, it's very nice.
Yeah.
So Southwest Minnesota became a place where I found the world and I found myself, but it's a place where I made the world and I made myself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that interplay between doing and making. So that I could go on how it led to rivers, my interest in rocks and soils and so on. But so much was worthy of study and writing, and I tried to do that in rural studies and our publications. But I want to start by I want to end by saying I'll start our next and last meeting explaining how writing became a path to meaning of self and the world. I'll start there. But before I close, just in the spirit of the other talks, I'd like to read two quick poems if I can.
Absolutely.
And they're short. Rosie, where are the poems? Here they are. Okay. The first poem is how I combined my father, a Sicilian, how I combined him with America and the old country. Because he didn't want to go back to Sicily. My grandmother didn't. But they were nevertheless, in great part, by food, language, emotion, Sicilian. So here's a poem to my father called The Sicilian Father. Now, I could have written this to all my grandparents, my uncles, and so on, but here's my father. My father is again reclined in his recliner. He has reached the age of bad habits, constantly clearing his throat, twiddling his thumb, insulting, finding fault, doing crossword puzzles, and dozing off. He is 70. Reclined in his recliner, he appears to be practicing dying. His face is long and drawn. His breath is deep, precariously hesitant. He sleeps as if he is without dreams. As sons everywhere, I'm drawn to and repulsed by my sleeping father. Fleeing him, I seek out the land of his father and mother. In Sicily, at the Greek temple Segesta, one of my favorite places in Western Sicily, raised 7 centuries before Christ, I observed how snails, circular temples themselves, now decorate the dead bleached white stems of bent, scattered plants. The small birds fly in and out of the roofless, half-standing temple. They treat it like a clump of trees building nests on its highest ledges. I follow the shepherd and his flock higher up to the amphitheater that surveys the land and sea below. I sit on the highest row of curved stones among grazing sheep, asking what tragedies fed ancient Sicilian dreams. So that was the poem to my father. And then a last poem to Sicily. Why I write of Sicily, because I did write, look,
My
there we
three
are.
Sicilies, there it is.
My Three Sicilies, which has poetry. It was my attempt to write short stories. I think that's not too bad.
That's a wonderful book.
And so on. So now I'm going to read Why I Write of Sicily. Let's see, what 133. Sicily became a way for me to think about the world. And so every part of it talked to something. But why I write of Sicily in the most short poem. If I could take back from time what God so generously gave in flesh and form, and time stole back through accident, disease, chaos, and death, I would have life, green in freshness and love, be my daily Eucharist and grace-given memory, the evening chalice of the morrow's hope. So that's why I write of Sicily. So that's my 7 dips into the world, or the world's 7 dips into me.
Thank you. That was really, really nice. And we'll end the recording and look forward to our next conversation, which will happen in 7 days, the next Wednesday. So
that's right. That's right. And Rosalia's leaving for Boston tomorrow.
okay. Have a good trip, Rosalia.